Hi guys, thank you for being here today. We have a third panelist, Aniket Shah, who's unfortunately running a little bit late, living up to the stereotype of an investment banker working all the time. So as soon as he's here, we'll have him on. But we're lucky to have Steve Davis with us. Professor Steve Davis, until very recently, was a professor at the University of California, Irvine. He's now the head of climate science at Watershed, which is a fascinating startup, really working with companies across industries, helping them understand the carbon conundrum and make head and tails of what's going on in the carbon accounting sphere. So, Professor Davis, if you could start by talking to us a little bit about your story and what Watershed does, that'll be a great start.
Sure. Well, thanks for that introduction. So, as Arya just said, I, until very recently, was a professor of Earth System Science at UC Irvine, where I did research on climate science, been part of the National Climate Assessment, IPCC reports, that kind of thing. And then just in the last couple of months, I've taken this role as head of climate science at Watershed, which is a startup company geared at solving some of the problems that we've been learning about this morning. So bridging this gap between ambition on the part of a company and actually taking actions to reduce their emissions. So what Watershed does is to help other companies measure, report, and reduce their CO2 emissions. And we do that with a fancy package of software that can do it very quickly, as opposed to some of the sort of big consulting firms that may take a year or more and a lot more money to shepherd a company along the way. So.
And this is probably a question you get a lot, but what prompted the shift from academia into business?
You know, it's something that I've written a lot of papers over the years, and some of them have been popular, but you never really know if you're having an impact with those things, like if anyone is actually reading your research. So I kind of wanted to at least give it a try to do a tour of duty in the private sector and see if I couldn't get a little closer to the actual decision making.
Yeah, that's an important thing to be doing. Aniket, thank you for coming.
Sorry I'm late.
It's okay. We're happy to have you. You must be a little tired from running across town, but...
Running across town, the E train was down, got into a taxi, but I'm here, so apologies.
Yeah. What are you going to do? So to put you on the spot straight away,
yeah.
Please tell us a little bit about your work at Jeffries and what you're looking at.
Sure. Good to see you, and thanks for having me, Arya. So Jeffries is a investment banking organization, and we advise investors and corporates on all types of capital markets activities. My job is to advise corporates and investors on sustainability, climate, ESG, and all of the synonyms that come from that, and all the acronyms that are part of that lingo. And that means on any given day, we are advising a large sovereign wealth fund on what the Inflation Reduction Act means for their investments in natural gas, to advising a company that we're taking public on what do they need to do if they're going to be a publicly listed company with regards to climate and ESG.
Interesting. So keeping you very busy all the time.
Yeah, exactly. It's a busy time.
So to come back to carbon accounting for a few seconds, Steve, I'd love if you could talk about, what's going on in the space. There's so many different initiatives. There's different initiatives in the US. There's a different set of initiatives in Europe. And there are of late a couple of platforms and programs trying to unify these things. But from the perspective of a company, it's still a very, very confusing space. So how is Watershed thinking about that?
Yeah, so there's a long track record of people who have done carbon accounting on some level or other, sometimes focused on a specific product, sometimes at the corporate level. And there actually has been a protocol, the greenhouse gas protocol, that's been developed to do these kinds of accountings and tells you what to put into what bucket. And that's fairly well established. What's new now is that a lot more companies are interested in actually doing this and disclosing the results of those sorts of accountings. And that's still at this point mostly voluntary in the US. In Europe, we can actually sort of see the future, which is to say that there are some requirements now in the UK already in effect, in the rest of Europe that will be in effect very shortly, where all the publicly traded companies are going to be required to report their carbon footprints. Mm-hmm. And there's SEC regulations sort of underway to make that the case in the US as well.
So there is the perception in the space that there's a lot of greenwashing and the system can be gamed to a certain extent. And there's a lot of conversation about carbon offsets versus emissions reduction versus capture and storage. What do you advocate for in terms of emissions versus offset?
Well, this is where I kind of come at it from the standpoint of someone who's studied the climate scenarios and the energy emission scenarios at the global level. And what we see in IPCC scenarios that actually reduce and avoid 1.5 degrees of warming is a lot of reductions and only some carbon removals. And usually, if you look at the scenarios produced by the models, it's about 90% of the way that it has to be reductions. And the residual 10% could be sort of these natural climate solutions or other sorts of carbon dioxide removal technologies. So I think that, depending on the sector that a company's in, that's the kind of ratio that companies ought to be thinking about, rather than just immediately going out and buying carbon credits of some sort to take up 100% of their footprint.
Got it. And Watershed, as I mentioned, is a really interesting company in the space and doing a lot of cool things. I did ask you this before, and I want to have us walk through this again. When a company comes to Watershed and shows intention, how are you helping them convert that intention to action?
It's a good question, and it really kind of depends on the company, right? Some of our customers come in and have never really thought about climate before, and they just want to get a first pass sense of where emissions are in their business and the supply chain. So that's sort of a different conversation. You have to start that measurement and identify the hot spots and start to prioritize actions, versus some customers of ours come in with a lot of experience. For example, we've been working with Walmart. They have a huge legacy of having done a lot in this space on sustainability. And so it's a very different conversation when you're working with a company like that, where they've already know their hotspots and they really want to dig deeper and figure out the key leverage points that they still haven't pulled.
Yeah. And Aniket, carbon accounting is a small aspect of the overall picture that you're looking at. So why don't you place what carbon accounting is as a mechanism into the larger goal for us?
Yeah, it is a part of the broader question of how a company gets its operations and its product lines in line with the broader effort around climate change. In general, the carbon accounting topic is a little too complicated and too detailed for most investors to spend much time on. They want to know rather that companies in their portfolios are on a pathway that is aligned with the Paris Agreement, and the heuristic that folks use is the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So for investors, what they're looking at is, does this company have an SBTI? What are they doing to be in line with the SBTI? And as you know, the Science-Based Targets Initiative is somewhat skeptical about the role of carbon offsets. Just like Steve mentioned, most of the focus is really on reductions, and then for a very small part of what's left over, you can use carbon offsets. I will say, though, that I'm generally in support of carbon offsets and the carbon credit market for one simple reason, which is at some level we have to pay for the things that we haven't been paying for. It's a very basic point to me, which is that there is a cost for us to be in line with planetary boundaries. I would argue the benefits are greater than the cost, but there is a cost to it. And I think those of us in the ESG world have for too long articulated this as a win-win-win-win-win. There's no one has to pay for anything. No, you do have to pay for it. This is one mechanism to pay for it. Is it the only way? No. Should it be for only certain sectors? Yes. Is the system working perfectly right now? Absolutely not. But I don't find it useful that, especially sadly these days, journalists are out there almost every day criticizing the carbon markets when we're just trying to get these things off the ground. So you can put me on the camp or in the camp of we have to figure this out. It is one part of the larger pie. And we have to be a little more supportive of both nature-based solutions and engineered solutions, because we will need to figure out carbon removals at some level.
Yeah, finally we have some disagreements. So it's always exciting to have two sides on the panel. But Aniket, I want to push you a little bit further to talk a little bit about net zero. and net zero by 2050, and whether the existing methodologies and standards are going to get us there, or whether they're really not relevant because we're not going to get there anyway?
I think that investors and corporates are in general confused around the net zero topic in one simple way, which is they usually conflate having a net zero portfolio if you're an investor, or a net zero company if you are a CEO, with a world that is actually net zero. It's a big leap, an intellectual leap that people make, which sounds simple, but I mean, it sounds almost, it's humorous that people make that mistake, but it is a mistake that people make. I see this with investors all the time, where they say, oh, our portfolio is in line with net zero. Okay, that's great. You sold your hydrocarbon assets to somebody else. What does that actually do for the real world? Or they say, oh, we're pushing companies to be net zero. Great, then that company just sold their fossil fuel assets to a private equity firm, but has done nothing in terms of the real world emissions. And by the way, as an investment bank, we make money on every permutation of that. So, all
just
of that is
happy.
Yeah. It just I'm fine with that financially, but if the project that we are trying to do is how to get the world to net zero by 2050, well, then it's actually a very significant change in our business and in our functioning as society, which is why I've been skeptical of net zero by 2050. It gives me no great joy to say that. The advocate in me would like and does everything I can in nights and weekends to get to net zero by 2050, but the analyst in me, the researcher in me, says we are not on that path. We would require more CO2 reductions every year for the next 28 years than we had during COVID, when the economy effectively didn't shut down, but really slowed down and people weren't flying. So I don't see how we would get there, which is not to say that we shouldn't stop trying, but it's also to say that we need to be a little clearer in our thinking around what's the project we're trying to solve for, or what's the problem we're trying to solve for.
Exactly, and I think you also talk often about how ESG is different from net zero. So if you could talk about that, and what is ESG solving for, and what is net zero looking to solve?
Great question. Arya was my star student at Columbia, so he's asking all the right questions. And I didn't give him an A just for this. He deserved the grade. But ESG is an effort in the financial industry to better understand and analyze environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities. The end goal of ESG is not to make the world a better place. It's not to solve climate change. It's actually an analytical project. It's saying, I'm going to buy the stock of GE, for example. I want to analyze the environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities that come with this company and make sure I'm buying it at the right price. That's what the ESG project is. Mm-hmm. You can do an ESG analysis and still end up owning Exxon. There's nothing inconsistent about that. Net zero is about actually either aligning your portfolio, your business operations, or I would argue what our project should be is aligning the world to a path of net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 or by some date. That is actually putting a constraint or a second objective into the model. It's around optimizing your risk-adjusted returns and being in line with a climate scenario. And that is a different project. And by the way, that project might mean that you decrease your returns over certain periods of time, or that there's disruptions in your business operations and so on, because you've added a different constraint to your function. So that's how we think about the difference. And I'm glad, Stuart Kirk at HSBC, who became famous because he went out there and said that climate change isn't that big of a deal and so on. I think there was a lot that he said that was wrong. It was very crass and so on. But one of the useful things that he's doing is he is drawing a line in the sand between ESG and net zero. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that we all need to do in this industry.
Yeah. And Steve, in line with what Aniket just said, where do you see Watershed coming in? Is it creating better ESG data that investors can go on to use, or companies can go on to refine processes? Or is it fundamentally helping companies to achieve net zero?
So we don't push any specific target. It's more about what the company's goals are and ambitions are. But many of our customers do want to reach net zero. And I think that, as Aniket rightly said, maybe there's a debate to be had whether an individual company has to reflect the globe. I think maybe where I land a little differently than Aniket is, I think we can actually reduce our emissions a lot at cost or without spending a lot of money. So we've already kind of heard from you that you think that there really is this extra cost to pay. And I agree completely that to get to net zero, there certainly will be.
Yeah.
But I think we could probably have 80% reductions in a lot of footprints without a big cost. And so what I see is Watershed's role is to help companies who don't understand where that 80% is to get there. And then we can talk about the last bit, right?
Yeah, and I would say in terms of cost, it's not just, cost of renewables is lower than cost of fossil fuels, because that's, or the other way, but there's a transaction cost, there is friction, there is a change that needs to happen, there's CEOs who have to change their mindsets, boards who have to think about things that they wouldn't otherwise, and that's, in addition to the financial costs, that I actually consider those costs to be higher. It's the mindset shift. And all the time investment that it requires to say, okay, we're actually going to go and try to work on these issues. And then great people like Steve and his company can come in and say, well, we can actually do this at cost parity. Or heck, we can even save you money. And then the light bulbs really go off.
Yeah. So in light of what you've said about the level of change needed, governments have their transition pathways. Several financial institutions have made commitments. Mark Carney says we have $130 trillion. That's all the money we need. Do we have a blueprint to go about making this change, or is what we've done so far just not nearly enough?
I mean, I think that we definitely have blueprints for some companies and for some sectors. There's been a lot of great modeling done in the last couple of years about how the U.S. economy could be net zero. And there is a big price tag associated with that transition. But actually, if you look as a percentage of GDP, the energy system costs are comparable to what they have been in recent years. It's just we're no longer buying fuels. We're spending it on capital infrastructure, solar and wind and so forth. So I think we actually have a roadmap for that. It's a big deal. It's a huge industrial shift, as Aniket rightly points out. But I do think we actually have a pretty good sense of how that could happen.
I think one of the challenges of the whole financial system with regards to green, first of all, Mark Carney really, and I say this with all due respect, but he really misunderstands the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which I believe he runs.
I was hoping you'd say that.
Because many of my clients are these net zero asset managers who have signed on to this. And I do I have the hard job of actually engaging with the portfolio managers and the investors there and the chief investment officers. And there's a big difference between what these companies have signed on to aspirationally and what they do in reality. And so, and by the way, part of that, just to be very micro about this, if you're an asset manager and you signed on to the NZAM, it can be just for a portion of your assets.
Yeah.
So if you're managing $100, you can say only $10 are in line with net zero, but the number that Governor Carney used is the whole $100.
Yeah.
So it's actually, I actually think it was I actually think that number we need to, again, be a little more detailed about it than what the headlines like to suggest. I think the challenge for me is that there is certainly financing available for the renewable transition. There's also financing available for the fossil fuel sector because the world still demands fossil fuels. We look at the lending from major banks to the fossil fuel industry has not gone down since the Paris Agreement, and 80+% of the world's energy demand today still is fossil fuels. Yeah. And so yes, there is money for the transition, but it's not that we're just shutting down oil tomorrow or shutting down gas and coal and switching over to renewables. It is a transition. The problem is that every time we keep financing more fossil fuels, you're embedding carbon for a long, long time. So that's where I see the issue, is that it's a both challenge. There's money available for oil and gas and coal, and there's money available for renewables. the IEA net zero scenario makes it very clear that if we are to get to net zero by 2050, no new investments in fossil fuels starting 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's where, that's actually just a fascinating, that report people should really read and reread, because there's your blueprint. And look at that world and look at the world as it currently is operating. There are two different worlds, by the way.
Yeah.
So
do you think, Glasgow Financial Alliance has come together, Mark Carney is doing a lot with private financial institutions. Is regulation behind? We've seen over the last couple of months and in the past week, the Inflation Reduction Act and the California Climate Commitment, which is $54 billion to climate programs. So how can states and countries play their role to consolidate legislation towards these issues?
I mean, I think we have to be optimistic about these recent policy wins, but we also have to be cognizant that that's not going to completely get us there, right? It's just bringing the private capital to the table, really.
Yeah.
So it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars, sure, but we need trillions of dollars a year to get us on a track for net zero. And so I think that, when I look at the sort of committed emissions and the inertia of the system, I actually see that we're not building a lot of new coal-fired power plants. Mm-hmm. And we may be building a little bit more in the natural gas space, but the capital costs are actually quite a bit lower, and I feel like it's possible to walk away from those things. So the research that I've done on committed emissions would actually suggest that maybe we are cresting this sort of hump where most of the new energy generation coming online is renewable. Yeah. And once that happens, that sort of moment, then all of a sudden the incumbent technologies don't look as great anymore. They're not growing anymore. They're not going to bring you gains. And so you get this sort of switch that flips over towards the renewables. That's what I'm hoping happens.
It is certainly true in certain countries and certain regions. I would remind everyone in the room that coal as a percentage of the global energy mix has been roughly the same for the last 25 years. And it's not like for the last 25 years, nothing has happened in solar or in wind or in hydro or in nuclear. It's just the system is extremely inert. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. I think the big success is that now even emerging markets and emerging economies are slowing down coal. That is a total game changer, because it was the West that was decreasing coal and the East or the global South that was increasing. Now that is also being tampered down. So that makes me very optimistic. I'm not in the doom and gloom camp, by the way, just for the record. I think that this is not, but I'm also a numerate person, which of course we're with a scientist here. So and I think it's important that we be numerical about this. I also think that in the short term, we have to understand that let's not look at the world in black and white. I think that's a very important part of especially last year. It is not the case that all oil and gas companies are bad. It is not that case at all. It is not the case that all renewables companies are, quote, good. I don't even know what those words mean. I don't know what an ESG stock means. We have to get beyond those easy, simple definitions and say, here's company X, it's in the fossil fuel industry, but it's figuring out hydrogen. Now, what do we think about hydrogen? Where does that play? And let's get to that level of discussion. And I think that will allow this space to move a little more quickly, because we need everybody involved. I spent a lot of time in Texas with major energy companies, and I'm not an apologist for them at all, but they feel like their voice cannot be heard, even though they have the engineering power to do a lot of the things that are needed. And I think we need to be more constructive there.
Yep. On the note to give everybody a voice, we've run out of time. Thank you guys for being here, and thank you, Aniket and Steve.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Hey, sorry I'm late. Sorry.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Sorry.